Hi, Hunter Hastings here. We're all dedicated to making the world a better place through entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship, whether it's individuals or teams or corporations, perform the function of empathically analyzing customer needs and designing and developing a new solution to those needs, and then bringing it to the marketplace for the customer's approval. To do that requires not just the economic function, it requires a system. We need partners to manufacture or develop the components or the technology that helps us develop the solution and ultimately deliver it. We need retailers. We need office buildings and factories. We need bars and restaurants to conduct our business. We need education to develop the talent and the people that we need to staff our businesses. That's a system. In fact, the word that's come out these days is ecosystem. We all need entrepreneurial ecosystems in which to operate.
This is the Value Creators Podcast. Value creation is the sole purpose of any business and every business, and for all of us as entrepreneurs. Listen to great value creators as they share their successes, trials, and lessons learned. Join us as we explore how to think as value creators, how to act as value creators, and how to view business through the lens of value creation.
Our guest today designs and builds those ecosystems. He's Jeff Amerine. He's got 30 years of deep tech and business leadership experience in every size of company from Fortune 500 to startups. He runs a venture capital fund, and he also runs a consultancy he calls Startup Junkies Consulting. He teaches entrepreneurship at the University of Arkansas. He's steeped in entrepreneurship, and he's going to tell us how to design and build the entrepreneurial ecosystem. Jeff, welcome to the Value Creators Podcast.
Oh, thanks so much for having me on, Hunter. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Well, we are too. We're all about entrepreneurship, and you're all about entrepreneurship. So we're going to learn from you today. We're going to learn about entrepreneurial ecosystems, really interested in deconstructing that word, and you have an operating way of building ecosystems. So we're eager to find out. So where I always like to start is, how do you define entrepreneurship, Jeff? Because people define it differently. You're a very practical viewer of entrepreneurship. So tell us how you define it.
Yeah, in fact, in many ways, it becomes, in some respects, an overused word. And there's at times a mythology that entrepreneurship is the 19-year-old Stanford dropout wearing a hoodie and drinking Diet Mountain Dew and eating ramen noodles and building a unicorn, which is not really the way we define it. We think of entrepreneurship as a mindset. It's see a problem, solve a problem. It's those people that are constantly dissatisfied with the status quo. Entrepreneurial mindset and entrepreneurs, they might be creating a new venture. They might be involved in a nonprofit, some kind of social change. They might be in a large business and an innovator, somebody that's a disruptor or change agent in a large business. But it's really mindset. See a problem, solve a problem, figure out how to build the team to solve a problem. That's kind of how we define it.
Yeah, I love that. I agree. It's mindset. We talk a lot in economic terms because we're econ junkies as well as startup junkies. So we talk about pursuing new economic value for customers and thereby creating value for yourself. But it's the same thing. It's a mindset. It's as opposed to a process or something mechanical. So you create venture ecosystems. I'm taking that from your book, Creating Startup Junkies is the title of the book. And you do it, you say, in unexpected places. So let's go there. How do you think about and define an entrepreneurial ecosystem?
Well, sure. So this entrepreneurial ecosystem is, the way we look at it is it's typically comprised of four important pillars. There's a pillar around talent, the idea that you have to have entrepreneurial talent. You have to focus on educating that talent. You have to have technical talent. So there's a talent pillar. The next pillar is capital, access to capital at all stages, from early stage to later stage. It can be debt and it can be equity, but there has to be this funding continuum and capital. The third piece is where the sort of coalition of the willing and the reinforcement comes in. And Brad Feld would call this, an event-driven model where you've got to have regular events and activities that draw people out and reinforce the realm of what's possible. So this whole idea of entrepreneurial culture, lots of events, lots of engagement is important. And then for us, the fourth pillar is the community engagement. We realized going through this process over the course of the last 15 years, and also as a serial entrepreneur before that, that you have to have your community engaged in terms of the municipality, the other organizations, NGOs, and chambers that are involved, large universities, and importantly, large enterprises as well. The flagship enterprises have realized over the past several years that startups and new ventures are not a competition for talent, but really where their competitive advantage may fall. So with those four pillars in mind, that's what can comprise the ecosystem. And what we did in the book that you mentioned, Creating Startup Junkies, was we looked at a process using something similar to a lean canvas. We call it the Venture Ecosystem Building Canvas. And it gives you the right questions to ask on each one of those pillars to find out where you are. Also to identify what are the assets, what are the aspirations, what are the constraints. But it gives you a systematic way, if you're in a smaller area, to say, what have we got that we can begin to work with? What do we need to do to get to the next step? And we also inject a fair amount of realism in it to say, don't start by building buildings. Too many of these areas have said, well, we're going to go build an entrepreneurship center. They don't have any of the community building done. There's no programmatics. There's not any kind of a coalition of entrepreneurs that have done anything. So start with the cheap stuff, the events and the community building and the gatherings first. And that's kind of the basis for the book. And the book was really written to say, not everybody's going to be in Austin or in New York or in Silicon Valley. What can you do in an area that hasn't had a long history of building scalable ventures or entrepreneurship? And that's really our passion.
We said entrepreneurship is a mindset, but you're saying it's also a talent, or you need some talent to support the mindset. How do you think about talent? Can you go into an area and say, there's just enough talent here to start an ecosystem?
It's a nature versus nurture question, right? I think there are some people that might have an inherent bias through the way they grew up or the way they were educated towards entrepreneurship. There are some people that have those tendencies. But I'm a firm believer as an entrepreneur educator and a former entrepreneur that it can be learned. And so part of the talent piece is finding those people that are willing. They want to take their destiny into their own hands. They maybe aren't wanting forever to be an employee number in somebody else's organization. They want to do something on their own. And then giving them the tools to have a higher degree of success. So it's training them on starting with the problem and lean canvas and customer discovery and understanding risk and getting the financial acumen. That can be trained. And really, it needs to start in K through 12. It needs to continue into college. It needs to be available in trade schools. A lot of times, again, we have this bias towards four-year college educated people. There are plenty of entrepreneurs out there that started as tradespeople, plumbers, electricians, carpenters. If you give them those skills to say, this is how to build a viable business, they can do great things. So when we think about talent, it's giving them the entrepreneurial toolkit and skills and education and support to be successful, to have a higher degree of success.
Yeah, mindset plus tools plus training, and that will bring out the talent. Okay, love that.
Exactly right.
Then the culture of the area. If an ecosystem hasn't started yet, how can you measure whether the culture is up for it?
Yeah, and this is something where I think you have to be really clear-eyed and realistic about, is it a possibility? There are areas, small areas that have, for example, historically been driven by when is the next plant and manufacturing operation going to be here? When is the next big employer going to come in? And sometimes that gets so ingrained in the DNA that they have a hard time breaking out of that and thinking, well, we can do things on our own. We can look at the assets we have and start our own businesses here. If in the area there is that historic DNA of it being a scrappy place where maybe there weren't a lot of large manufacturers, or there's things that can be pointed to say, with all the disadvantages you can imagine, these people built this amazing business. So in our area, for example, we think about the story of Sam Walton and Walmart, of Johnny Bryant Hunt and JB Hunt Transportation, of Tyson Foods. If you could put your finger on a map of the world 50 to 75 years ago and say, where's the likely place where three of the largest businesses in the world are going to be created? It wouldn't have been here. But somehow, it's kind of like salmon swimming upstream with every disadvantage you can imagine. through the power of belief and surrounding themselves with good people, they built outsized businesses. So some of that in that cultural thing is the storytelling, it's the reinforcement, it's the assessment of what's here, and it's bringing people in and pointing to those stories that will get people to realize. For example, J.B. Hunt's a guy that had dyslexia. Now he didn't know what it was called but he didn't get past about a sixth grade reading level, but he was incredibly inventive, a visionary in trucking. He's the guy that really invented intermodal trucking early on. He's the guy that figured out how to bundle and bale rice hulls from Southeast Arkansas and bring them to Northwest Arkansas that they could be used for lining the poultry houses so that you'd have less disease. He figured that out with no education because he was opportunistic. And so having some of that story, those stories to tell, those legacies to build on, and then just getting the activity going to where people can see those small successes and the activity and getting people to realize it's important. It's important. One of the things that was good in our area, even though it sounds like kind of a non sequitur, was when we had the financial reset in 2008. Prior to that time, the big businesses have been focused on geographic expansion. People were making a lot of money in real estate, et cetera. When that reset hit, people started to look around and say, we're not going to put money in the public markets. We're not going to make money on appreciating real estate. Maybe we ought to invest in local founders. And it brought people closer to home to look at what can we do without all of these externalities that have typically driven the growth in the area.
Yeah. It sounds like one or two individuals or individual companies maybe can be the catalyst for the bigger culture. Is that right?
It's hugely important. So I'll give you an example of some examples that are relevant here, but there's ones from all across the country. You look at somebody like a guy named Joe Ford, who was actually honored last night. He was one of the founders of Alltel, which was acquired by Verizon for $29 billion some years back. It was a telephone company. He came out of school. He went to a place called Stevens Bank, which at one time, this is in Little Rock, which at one time was the largest off Wall Street investment bank in the country. And he talked to a guy named Jack Stevens, who was the founder. And he said, I've got no experience in this, but I've got a vision. I want to go buy this local telephone company and I need $1 million to get it to the next step. And Jack Stevens took a risk and actually got involved because he saw something in Joe Ford that was unusual. So I think part of it is a matter of people that have the capital, that have the vision, investing in other people they see and really kind of pouring themselves into them. Very similar story could be said about Walmart and J.B. Hunt. Those were all underwritten by Stevens Bank. So once you start to get the belief around, look what they did, and they were really no better or no different than anyone else. These were not PhD level folks. If they can do it, I can do it. And then that story gets retold over and over again. And and the other thing is the virtuous cycle is when some of the things grow and there's wealth creation, those people that have been maybe in that next echelon of leadership, they go out and believe, well, I can do it too. And other great businesses begin to grow. So it's a sort of rolling snowball where you begin to believe that these things are possible.
Well, that's your capital pillar, or that's one of the pillars that you mentioned. A lot of the small or local or new entrepreneurial ecosystems, especially if they're just at the beginning, it's hard for them to get access to capital. You don't have Stevens Bank now. You got the local branch of Chase, which is not going to help you much. And if you're not, as you say, a unicorn in the venture capital community, then capital access is hard. Maybe there's some grants that you can get. Maybe there's some government assistance. But do you find that capital is hard to break into for these startup ecosystems?
Yeah, it's an ongoing problem, and it's one of the things where you've got to fill in the gaps from pre-seed and seed, sort of early stage angel investors, friends and family, all the way through to your later stage private equity and everything in between. And we've been at this 15 years. We still have gaps. There's still not enough good sources for pre-seed and seed, other than maybe non-dilutive funding that you get through Small Business Innovative Research Awards from the federal government. That said, there's also a real bias in the way we think about ecosystems in terms of you have to raise angel or venture capital. Plenty of great businesses have been built by having a virtuous operating cycle and getting revenues out in front of cost. So figuring out how to build your business on the back of the customer. The stat is something like 0.6% of all businesses that are created will actually get venture capital. Well, what does everybody else do? You figure it out. So some companies think, I want to have this scalable platform and it's going to be a SaaS-based thing. Why not start by leveraging what you already know how to do? What can you sell on a professional services basis? Get yourself to a point where you've got revenue traction, a lot more options, and then think about building the platform. So a lot of times, even though we're in the venture capital business as well, we'll try to talk people out of it. What can you go sell today so that you've got more options? What can you do through friends and family and people that are close to you? What can you do by bringing in subject matter experts that might want to invest time for equity? What are the alternatives out there? So a lot of times we try to change the discussion a little bit away from, well, I can't get anywhere because I can't raise the capital.
Yeah, in fact, if you go back in the history of capitalism, back to John D. Rockefeller and Carnegie and those folks, they funded their growth through profits. They recycled their own cash flow, and there was no stock market to help them and no venture capital to help them. So that's really the history of entrepreneurial capitalism.
It is. And to add to that, the happiest people you'll ever meet are the ones that, when they get to some kind of transaction down the road, own 100% of their business, because they focused on what can I sell today to begin to build a revenue stream.
Yep. Yeah, it's good advice. Community engagement. So is that kind of easy to start these days? Is the local bank going to help you? Is the branch of the big corporation that's in town going to help you? Or is that hard to generate?
It requires some evangelism. I've found, and this is going to maybe sound a little crass, but free coffee and beer and occasional food will attract a lot of people. We run this thing called the Startup Crawl, and it attracts 3,000 people a year. And there's about 15 microbreweries involved and 70 startups and bands and the whole bit. So part of it is just getting people called out to an event that's going to be comfortable to them, a reason to show up. And then along the way, intentionally engineered it for creative collisions, as the guys from Google would say. By virtue of having these smart people together, the magic begins to happen. We used to run this thing, still do, called Idea Fame, which was a 60-second elevator pitch contest. Think a little bit Gong Show, a little bit American Idol, a little bit Shark Tank, kind of fun, kind of irreverent, no notes, no slides, 60 seconds. But it's a spectacle, and there's prize money associated with it. We'd get 50, 100, 150, 200 people out. It was an easy way to get people who weren't sure what to think out to an event. And then over time, you can begin to layer in the webinars, the lunch and learns, startup stories, game changer types of events, all those sorts of things. People get comfortable coming out because they realize it'll be a good use of their time. They're going to learn something, they're going to meet someone, etc. Now, to your point, getting the large companies to believe it's in their best interest, you have to be really targeted in making sure that they understand that you're going to put things in front of them ultimately that are going to help their competitive advantage. And that requires a lot of back and forth. Large companies can inherently be kind of myopic, thinking they can figure it out on their own, or they're going to use another large third party. So they've got to be pulled in progressively. Say, hey, we just want you to show up to do a little mentoring, no obligation. And then they see some of this amazing stuff that's being worked on from around the world or in the area, and they start to believe, yeah, this is worth paying attention to. But it's a long march and a hard process to get them engaged.
So how does the long march start, Jeff? I noted in your book that startup junkies could be economic developers, they could be Chamber of Commerce executives, there could be government officials, there could be some kind of educational leader, there could be a nonprofit. Give us a couple of here's how it started stories. Who initiates?
Absolutely. Here, this is a point where I'll agree completely with what was said in startup communities and the startup community way. Is I think it has to be entrepreneur-led to begin with. You have to have the people that have done it, that have walked in those shoes. It can't kind of be like a 5-year proletariat-generated authoritarian plan that there shall be entrepreneurship. And so consequently, it starts with the most credibility when it's people like myself and others that have seen the good, bad, and the ugly of entrepreneurship and they stand up and say, we can do this, and here's how. And I understand the pain associated with it because I lived through it. I mean, there were times when I choked on the toothpaste, brushing my teeth in the morning, wondering how I was going to make payroll. So I think you have to have entrepreneurs out front that are in that mode where they want to give back because they understand how difficult it is. And then they can bring in the other people that are crucially important, that can be supportive to building the kind of structure and activity and programming that you need. And that for sure can be chambers, it can be bankers, it can be lawyers, it can be large company executives that maybe have an innovation charter. All of those folks are necessary, but it's got to start with the entrepreneurs out front if you want to have credibility.
There's some thought that it's easier to tap into platforms now that weren't there before. You can get your compute services from AWS, and you can get all kinds of AI engines that are available these days and that kind of thing. Is that making things easier for those entrepreneurs to get started?
Well, it is. If you draw the example of what things looked like in the 1990s when I was trying to build telecommunications companies and software companies, there's been a significant democratization of the availability of great tools. They're lower cost, they're more widely available, working with flexible teams, some of which are remote on a fractional basis or better. AI is going to be a game changer. A lot of the stuff that we spend a lot of staff hours on now in terms of customer discovery or building lean canvases or just doing good searches, getting competitive analysis, the AI is making all that even more accessible than it ever was. So you can get good data, good answers, good content, good things put together more efficiently now than you ever could. I think it's a game changer. And part of the reason why that's important is you look at the birth rates and the immigration rates in most places, we've got to figure out how to do more with less. Because even though we've got this low participation rate, you can't find all the people you need. So the more productivity that you can have through tools, it's not like it's a nice to have or necessarily a competitive advantage. It's kind of a must have. You need to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. What about universities, Jeff? You mentioned them in your book. Typically, we often associate them with these startup ecosystems, and Stanford University is the one that everyone quotes. But most universities have an entrepreneurship system or a accelerator or an incubator. Are you finding that they're a good source of energy for your ecosystem?
Absolutely. And whether or not it's a major research university like we have locally with the University of Arkansas that's got an office of innovation entrepreneurship well established and growing, or whether it's a community college just that realizes the people that they're training have to have business skills and might want to start their own business, having those institutions of higher education engaged is really important. The advantage you have in a 4 to 6 year educational program is you can probably build some kind of side hustle, some kind of business, whatever it may be, during that 4 to 6 years with lower risk than what you're going to be able to do when you're farther down the road and have more social commitments, maybe more life commitments, maybe a family. And so tapping into students at that age, getting them bit with the idea of this is possible. I don't have to train just to be an employee in a big organization. That's crucially important. And in fact, as we build our organization over the last 15 years, a lot of the key people that are in our group started as entrepreneurial students. They came in as interns. We offered them full-time jobs. They rose through the ranks. With a name like Startup Junkies, some of them see really cool operating companies or concepts. They go out and start their own things. So I think it's hugely important to have that talent pool that's got an open mind, fresh ideas. They don't know all the reasons why what they're going to do could fail. And so they just get into stuff that they might not get into it when they have more social attachments or more commitments later on. I think it's hugely important.
So the university is both the source of talent and the source of education, right?
Both. And it's complementary. It's complementary. You know, we share. I actually am an adjunct and have been for 15 years. I teach new ventures at the U of A and do a lot of lecturing. So I think it's a symbiotic kind of relationship between the talent flowing in and out and creating the ecosystem that will be lasting.
And then you have an operating company that provides services. You call it an entrepreneurial service organization, right?
Support organization.
Organization, excuse me. Yeah. So tell us about the operational side of that. What do you do?
Yeah. So it's a good question. It's it's a little bit like this interesting merger or marriage of a McKinsey consulting type of entity with an event management company. So for the past 15 years, started out, it was just me. Now with 30 some people in multiple locations, including places like Seoul, South Korea. What we do is we provide advice, guidance, mentoring, coaching, etc., to about 2,000 plus entrepreneurs a year through one-on-one meetings and engagements. We run a couple of accelerators focused on AI, ML, cybersecurity, health tech. We run another one that's focused on just scaling up more conventional tech-enabled businesses. Lots of touch points. We put on about 250 events a year. The team is comprised of some serial entrepreneurs, some subject matter experts, some people that are really good at program management, and some folks that are really good at running events and marketing. We do a couple of podcasts. So it's also kind of a weird model. And the way we do it, I say it's an unsustainable business model we've sustained for more than 15 years. All of our services are completely free to the entrepreneurs that are between concept stage to about 15 million. There's no equity ties or anything else, but we've been able to pull that off by virtue of getting third-party funding from federal government. We run 2 of the Small Business Administration regional innovation clusters that are competitively awarded. We've had funding from Kauffman Foundation over time, USDA, University of Central Arkansas is a partner of ours for the Conductor, which is a public-private partnership, does the very same thing Startup Junkie does. We've had funding from the Walton Family Foundation. We also have a 501c3 to run that funding through. And so, having been an entrepreneur and having thought a lot about what kind of customers you want, I learned early on that customers with no money are really terrible customers. And it's every startup and small business you ever met, but they need the help. And so how are you going to get it to them? You got to be able to convince these funders who have economic development, economic growth mandates that we can provide the outcomes that show that the dollars you spend on us are significantly leveraged into more jobs, more ventures, more new products created, more patents, et cetera. And so we've been able to do this for as long as we have by delivering really solid outcomes, measurable outcomes.
And is that a pitch, Jeff? Do you go pitch these funding organizations, or is it an application process? Do they come to you? How does it work?
Kind of all of the above. No, I mean, you kind of hit it. Occasionally there'll be federal or state solicitations that say we want to have regional innovation clusters, or we want to have National Science Foundation, their innovation engines in different parts of the country. So you pursue that kind of stuff. Occasionally they'll come to us and say, you guys have been doing this. We think there's a need to do something in ag tech. Could you stand that up and do it? And we'll put together a proposal. Sometimes we'll figure out how to convince large corporate players that this is something that they need to think about because it can help them strengthen their sort of innovation footprint and their innovation footing and their competitive advantage. So it's a little bit of all of it. Lots of bid and proposal, lots of pursuit of grants, and occasionally inbound requests.
Yeah. Okay. I wanted to go back to one of the elements that you've mentioned a few times, and I forgot to ask the question, which is events. Now, events sounds like it's maybe a bit fluffy and it's not part of a business system, and it's theater. I think you use the term innovation theater in your book, as opposed to substance. But you use it in a much different way, it seems.
Yeah. Well, so in the context for innovation theater is, and this is something we occasionally see in larger corporations, is they decide they need to be innovative. And so they kind of check the box and do some things that are cursory or a facade, and they really don't accomplish a heck of a lot. What we do in events, they're all very purpose driven. Even if it's just in a gathering to get people together, talent is where this thing starts and ends. Team building is kind of essential. But if people don't know each other, if they're not in those environments where they can have those kind of conversations, they're not going to be able to build something. So some of the events, which are very procedurally oriented, are things like Startup Weekend. This is a Techstars thing. We run them a couple times a year. That's one of those things where over 54 hours over the course of a weekend, you get a group of 40, 50, 60 people together. They initially all pitch ideas they have. They then vote on the ideas that are of most interest. They then form teams. And through the course of that, they go out and do some customer discovery. They build a pitch. And in many cases, if you have 10 teams that are formed, you'll have 1 or 2 that actually go on and build something. So some of them are crucibles or gauntlets or a rapid vetting process to actually move things forward. Some of them are just truly gatherings for networking and socialization. Many of them are educational, where we'll get a speaker on who's built something pretty spectacular, and they'll give a lunch and learn, or they're a subject matter expert. They'll talk about cybersecurity or digital marketing or raising money. So it's all with the purpose, but sometimes the purpose is more subtle, really.
Yeah. Well, another word you mentioned there, which is easy to say and hard to do, I think, is networking. And that seems like, again, for a startup community that maybe doesn't have experience, doesn't have connections, networking is really, really hard. Can you help people with networking?
Yeah, it is, and to use a little bit of a colloquialism, we kind of rednecked our way into that in some respects, in that we just started doing things to see what would work. Getting people together around coffees. There's a thing that is called 1 Million Cups. The Kauffman Foundation pioneered about 20 years ago. Every Wednesday morning from 8 to 9, you get together. There'll be one company that presents. It's not like a Shark Tank setting, and it's all about how can the community help that venture get what it needs. But again, it's an excuse for networking. You'll have business leaders there. You'll have entrepreneurs. You'll have subject matter experts, developers. So I think the intentionality that goes into that networking is that regular drumbeat of activity and events. And so for us, any given week between our operating locations, we might have 4, 5, 6 events a week. As an example, tonight we're a Kiva lending hub. We run a micro loan program as well. We're going to have a celebration that brings all those people that have taken loans from Kiva over the course of the last 2 years, just to celebrate the fact that there's been over $1 million in lending. Now, out of that, one thing is you're celebrating the success in the program, but the other thing that comes from it is those businesses are going to be able to highlight what they're doing, and so that's where that network effect begins to kick in. The other thing is the pandemic. If there was any kind of upside out of the pandemic, was the fact that a very in-person business like us had to become very digital overnight if we were going to still reach everybody. So over that time frame, we took all the stuff that were typically in-person events and they became digital as well, including the podcast then took on the video aspect to it. All of that other content is available on our YouTube channel. That's another way where the networking kind of occurs. Those assets bring people together. They bring people into us. They allow us to do more with them, whether it's programs or additional activity.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to ask you about was time. So one of the things I find in these kinds of activities is it always takes longer than you think, and it's kind of frustrating. And it sounds like you're saying, hey, sow the seeds and time will take care of itself. Is that right?
Well, for sure. And I think this was probably an Asian saying that said the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best time is right now. And the other thing is people, a lot of times early on, if you think about it, our society is driven by quarterly returns and 4-year election cycles. And so we've got this inherently short-term mindset. People will say, well, when are we going to be Silicon Valley? And first of all, I'd say never. And we're not going to put Silicon anything in any program around here. We don't want to be the Silicon Hills or the Silicon anything else. That was a 75-year journey from the time that Major General Draper came back and the time that Fairchild Semiconductor was created. And they had a different way of thinking about do it. 75 years. We're 15 to 20 years into this. It's a long multi-generational march. But it's kind of like a rolling snowball. It starts out pretty slow and pretty small, and you just keep grinding away year after year. And if you can get the ecosystem leaders, those stakeholders, to believe and understand that if you stay with this, you'll see the results, then it can work. But you can't take a quarterly or even a every 4-year election cycle view of it. It's multi-generational.
Yeah. Are you still focused on Arkansas, or have you branched beyond that?
Well, we do have a really strong footprint in Arkansas, statewide, both Northwest and Central. We're going to do some more things because a lot of amazing things are happening in the state with building an ecosystem around South Arkansas and lithium extraction, with some of the things happening with Big River Steel in Northeast Arkansas, largest steel output in the entire country now. We're in South Korea. Part of the reason why we're in South Korea is I had done a lot of telecom business there in the 90s. We had a young guy that approached us who was a University of Arkansas grad that said, I think we can do something bridging these venture ecosystems. And so we've now got a footprint over there. We've got people on the ground and have worked with Korea International Trade Association, Korea Trade Promotion Agency, KAIST, which is their MIT equivalent. We've run a bunch of cross-border stuff where we'll run companies from over there that are really high potential that want to do U.S. market entry. Through our process, we'll connect them to the large enterprises that we have locally and get them ready to be enterprise ready to do business in the U.S. We'll continue to build those kinds of bridges. The difficult part of expanding a business like ours is it's trust-based. And trust-based businesses are difficult to scale. And so you have to have someone in that market that's already kind of well entrenched and well known. It can't be a bunch of people parachuting in from somewhere else saying, we're here to help. That doesn't go over extremely well. You have to have locals that are part of your team. And so that's what we're doing to expand. We'll be looking at other markets like Arizona and other places where opportunistically we've got good contacts and we think we can fill a lane in doing what we do.
So when you do that, when you do the bridging and you start multiple locations, does that lead to systematization? Here's the system that we're going to pursue, or does it remain entrepreneurial?
Well, it's a mix, right? You have to have enough structure to allow for scale and enough repeatable processes. And to that point, we're going through a major upgrade of how we manage outputs and outcomes and customer journey, client journey. We're going to upgrade some systems there because, quite frankly, we've done a lot of that stuff for the last 15 years with freely available tools like Google Sheets and Calendly and Zapier. And we're now getting to the point where we got to have kind of a real CRM and a real process. The startup junkie way, in terms of how we approach the Socratic process, the mentoring and coaching, that's been systematized. We built tools like the Growth DX, which is an analyzer that goes through 7 domains in a growing business and provides kind of an audit of what they're doing. So we are getting to the point where we've got tools and more process than we had before, when everything was pretty well bespoke based on our experience and judgment.
Yeah. Well, great, Jeff. Your book is Creating Startup Junkies. We'll link to that. May we share those tools that are in the appendix?
Oh, absolutely. The venture building ecosystem and all those questions. That book's a little bit of inspiration, but it's really intended to be a lot about education and toolkit. And if anybody wants to know more, wants to have a conversation, or wants to know how to get started, please have them reach out to us at startupjunkie.org, or they can check it out at creatingstartupjunkies.com. Those are both really good resources.
Well, I love what you do, Jeff, and it's exciting that you think in terms of ecosystems as opposed to a single startup business. I speculate about an entrepreneurial society, that we will find the way to where everybody is entrepreneurially oriented. They can still be in large corporations, but they're creating new value for customers as opposed to bureaucracy and financialization and the things that dominate now. But everybody will be an employee of the market. We'll all be driven by creating value for customers. Is that reasonable?
Could not agree more. I think you're seeing a lot of that in the gig economy. You're seeing a lot of that in the traditional social constructs and contracts between employees and employers have changed. And I really think entrepreneurialism, the startup movement, the startup mindset is the salvation of the world. I think it is the one thing that, if it's understood, can lift people up better than any government program or any other kind of largesse, because you take matters into your own hands.
Yeah, we believe the same things. And there's a concept of responsibility there, that I'll take responsibility for doing that successfully. Good, Jeff. Well, thank you very much for today. We'll leave those links for folks. We'll publish your blueprint, and we'll touch base with you maybe again in the future.
I would love that. Yeah, thanks for all you do, and thanks very much for having me on today.
This has been another episode of the Value Creators Podcast. Thanks for listening. You can visit thevaluecreators.com for links and resources related to this episode, and check out hunterhastings.com for more content on entrepreneurial business management based on value creation principles.